Well, good evening and welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. So fascinating conversation about what's going on in schools. And I'm joined right now with Harvey Bischof, president of the Ontario Secondary Schools Teachers Federation. Harvey, we've talked to a elementary school union leader. We've talked to a teacher. We've talked to some administration people. People are confused and worried. Tell me what you think.
I understand both the confusion and the worry. We've seen a government that squandered the opportunity to plan carefully for the reopening of schools that, it was uncertain when it would come, but we knew it would come at some point. We knew it would be a massively complex project to reopen schools in a pandemic, and yet I don't know what they were doing for weeks and months on end. We saw plans change multiple times. We saw school boards scrambling to do their best with, vague direction, come up with structures for reopening, only to have them rejected by the Ministry of Education, for sometimes unclear reasons. So I appreciate that there's a great deal of anxiety out there for parents, for students, and certainly for my members.
So what do you think we all should do? Some people are going back this week, a lot of people next week. I hear that some principal in Gatineau went out and his own money bought $5,000 worth of tents to set up some tents outside, and people are sitting on milk crates and stumps. What should we all do? And frankly, I see pictures of some outbreak 100 years ago or 75 years ago, and that's exactly what we did. We all took classes outside. Is that the solution?
It's hard to find. The solution's a little more elusive now, at least in the short term, than it would have been had we begun this planning weeks and months ago. What I would like to see is the government listen to the concerns we've raised in a half dozen different substantive areas around health and safety, and instead they're pushing forward, claiming that they're listening to the medical experts while clearly ignoring some of the critical advice they've been giving around things like number of students in class, ability to physically distance, and others.
So I think a day ago or so, a poll was released done by Campaign Research and published on the front page of the Toronto Star that really suggests that people in Ontario are supportive of the Ontario government and not supportive of the teacher's position. What do you think of that?
Well, I'm not, a public opinion poll when it comes to epidemiology and infectious diseases and so forth, it doesn't really particularly move me. What I've seen is a lot of polling, I must say, that says parents are deeply anxious, and there's about a half and half support for the plan and as opposed to opposition to this reopening plan. But here's the thing, we have experts. So it's not my expertise that I'm using here. I don't have a medical background. We have experts who are telling us that there are grave concerns around the fact that, for example, every other public space in the province requires 2 meters of physical distancing. And for some, by some magical thinking, our classrooms do not. This idea of not following, there's a Public Service Health and Safety Association. It's appointed by the Minister of Labour, and they've come up with standards around transportation, busing, and they've chosen not to apply those standards when it comes to busing students to school. They're ignoring that there are standards when it comes to ventilation. They have no standards. They're sending inspectors, Ministry of Labour inspectors, into work sites, and we don't know there's no objective yardstick that they're measuring ventilation against. So you have a group like the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, Air Conditioning Engineers, well-respected group, publish standards around reopening schools and universities during a pandemic. And they're not using those standards or any standards that we can determine whatsoever. So, my concern is less with the public opinion polling and more with the advice we're getting from experts in a variety of fields.
So this might be a little bit too tactical, but let's talk about it for a second. So my understanding, and you're probably well more knowledgeable in this than I am, is that the average Ontario school has ventilation that exchanges air with a statistic called 3 atmospheres changes per hour. And that what they were doing is granting money so you could get to 5 atmosphere changes per hour. That in planes, you don't have to socially distant, but you have to wear a mask. But that's because there's more than 10 and sometimes more than 15 atmosphere changes per hour. Sounds like schools have just got really terrible HVAC systems.
Well, I mean, in short, yes. And I don't claim to be an expert in this area any more than I am in epidemiology. And that's why we turn to experts like this ASHRAE group. But, we have schools, our schools in Ontario are sadly decrepit. There is a $16 billion repair backlog in Ontario's schools. They've been allowed to crumble. And that's, frankly, it's an embarrassment in a province like ours, if you ask me. But it also means that we have schools where, as we've heard, windows are painted shut. Ventilation is absolutely inadequate. The decision to come up with some money to put into ventilation was too late to really have it done in a timely fashion. And again, where you have industry respected standards, they ought to be using those as the measuring stick against which to determine whether or not our classrooms have an appropriate level of risk. And there, as in other places, they've chosen not to have those standards.
So why not go outside for the next month or so?
Well, to the extent that you can accommodate that, I mean, there has been some idea of doing that where you can. There are certain days where that's possible. There are certain circumstances where that's possible. It's not a solution across a 2 million student education system.
I spoke with a teacher earlier in the show, and in her situation, and I'm not sure if it's unique or common, she said it solved itself. The problem solved itself because half of her students decided to go into virtual learning. So she's only got 14 students. And so she says, perfect class size.
Well, that's great. That's not the norm, because instead what we've been hearing is exactly what's been happening in so many schools across the province. As students, as parents opt their children out of the return to face-to-face learning and they move them to online, what's happening is classes are being collapsed, so that you will have in our schools empty classrooms besides fully packed classrooms, because you have to have educators who are working with the students or online. You have to have others who are going to be delivering the face-to-face learning. The ministry had a choice here. They had a clear choice. They could have hired up. They could have had enough educators to occupy all of those rooms, but to have an empty room beside a full room in the midst of a pandemic, to me is utterly irresponsible.
And why are we going to have an empty room? That's because we just don't have enough teachers?
Because where you had two classes that where a lot of students left for online learning, those two classes of face-to-face students, or maybe more in some cases, will be combined all together in one room. And so we've heard of three-way split level classrooms now, three grades in one room. And it's because the ministry made the choice not to provide the funding that would have allowed for staffing to have an educator in every room delivering curriculum, and therefore allow for the distancing that, as I say, is required in every other public space.
You've undoubtedly seen some of the statistics in Israel when it reopened. The epidemic rates went up dramatically, not only with students, but with people that they then interacted with back at home and in the community. You've probably seen some of the statistics in the southern U.S., which opens up their schools in sort of mid-August, and similar kind of increase in epidemic infection rates are up. What's your fear?
Well, that our schools become the centers of increasing infection and become the vectors for increasing infections, so that children, educators become sick in schools, but then they take that home. They take that home to families. They take it out into the communities in which they live, and that the schools with insufficient risk mitigation in place serve to reignite the kind of spread that we're seeing before, and that simply won't do anybody any good. Obviously, it's a case where the money saved by not, for example, providing adequate staffing could very easily be spent in healthcare and loss of revenues if businesses are required to reclose and so forth, and that would be quite tragic.
If that happens, what do you think should happen? Should we close down that school, that class, entire schools?
Well, I mean, there are protocols for that, and again, that's a call for public health authorities to make in terms of how do you mitigate spread if and when there is an outbreak in a school. Preferably there would be no outbreaks, but the way to increase the likelihood that there are not school level outbreaks are by following some of the measures that we've proposed and are currently in the process of taking forward to the Labor Board.
Numerous different companies are just telling people to stay and work at home until January. And you made a comment earlier that every other public institution has a 2-meter distance rule in it. Why are we treating schools and kids different? I guess my concern is that we're doing that because we see the mortality rate for people of under 20 or under 10, whatever that statistic is far lower than it is for adults, if not frankly almost zero. That said, I've had people on my show talking about vascular problems, that the respiratory issues that cause the person to go to ICU and get on a ventilator is something that obviously is the number one and most immediate concern and concern for elderly people, but that other people that get infected and don't go to the hospital, let alone an ICU, have vascular issues that can lead to blood clots and to brain fog in the brain that leads to cognitive challenges for a long period of time. Are we playing gambling with our kids?
It's an unacceptable degree of risk, if you ask me. Now, any reopening is going to have some risk, but I concede entirely that there's a risk in keeping students at home too. So you have to balance risk. You keep students at home, it has a negative impact on the quality of the education you're able to deliver to them. There's a loss of social, emotional growth, all of those things. And so there is a risk there, but there was a way to mitigate the risk in schools. I mean, I'll speculate as to why this particular path is being pursued. It's really, in some ways the government's question to answer, but I'll speculate that from the outset, they decided how much they were willing to spend and said, how much health and safety can we buy with this amount of money? Rather than saying, what's an appropriate level of risk and what will it cost? What sort of resources need to be put into the system in order to lower the risk to that level? And that's not what they've done, which means that they are then gambling with some of the unknowns. We don't know the longitudinal effects on children who might get the virus. Absolutely, the science is developing every single day. And when the science is uncertain, as it is right now, as it continues to develop, that's exactly the time when you should invoke the precautionary principle. That's when, under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, you put every precaution reasonable under the circumstances in place, because you don't know everything. And this was a principle that arose, out of the inquiry following SARS. Good heavens, it's not that long ago in our memory. We should not have lost the memory that precautionary principle was critical, wasn't followed appropriately during SARS, has not been followed appropriately for the school reopening.
We're chatting tonight with Harvey Bischof, president of the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation. We're going to take a quick break and come back with some concluding comments. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Well, fascinating conversation. We've talked to a local Peel elementary school union leader. We've talked to a teacher. We've talked to a parent. We've talked to an administrator. And we're now talking with Harvey Bischof, who's the president of the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation. Harvey, there was a judge in a parental dispute that decided, when the two parents were arguing, one for health reasons that the kid should stay home and the other one for educational reasons that the kid should go to school. The judge found that the social development and educational reasons were more important and sided with the parent that wanted the kid to go to school. You may have heard about this judgment. And lawyers that I've had on my show are saying that this is sort of precedent setting, that the judge for the first time is really choosing education over health. I was part of a summit analysis of the impact of kids losing out on education or summer jobs or first jobs. And if they lose out on any of those things, they're impacted negatively for the rest of their lives. And it's not just the education, it's the social interaction, it's the connections, it's sort of that, push into society that they lose out on. On balance, do you think we should be getting kids back to school?
Yeah, I just think that we could have, with a properly resourced, appropriately collaborative plan put together between the ministry and the voice of frontline educators like my union and the others in the province, and of course the experts in a variety of fields, we could have done this much more safely. I think it's critical to get kids back to face-to-face learning. Distance learning, electronic learning, has a role, but for a small percentage of kids, is it really the most effective way to learn? For the vast majority, the most effective way is face-to-face. And so for individual students, but look, for me, the publicly funded education system has always been the great democratizer. It's the great opportunity for access to equity for people within our society. It's not perfect in that regard. We absolutely have work to do when it comes to providing equity for, kids who are marginalized in different ways, racialized students lower on the socioeconomic spectrum. But they have a better chance if they have access to a good, well-funded, publicly funded education system, as we've had in Ontario, than if they're left to their own devices, definitely.
Harvey, do you have a message for any parents that are struggling with the decision tonight as to whether they're going to send their kids back to school next week? What's your recommendation to them?
I wouldn't presume to recommend to an individual parent, so many different things, family dynamics, whom you live at home with, what the health situation of that student is, where you are in the province. I mean, as we're seeing, areas in Toronto are different from other areas in Toronto, are completely different from Timmins, for example. What I would say is this: my organization, working along with the other education unions, we're doing our absolute best to require this government to follow some standards that would appropriately lower the risk of returning to face-to-face classrooms. We'll continue to fight for that because we think it's best for the people in this province. And there have been lots of parents who support that same call, and we're more than happy to work with them.
Harvey Bischof, President of the Ontario Secondary Schools Teachers Federation, thank you so much for joining us tonight on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour.
My pleasure. Thank you.
We really appreciate it. Well, that's our show for tonight. You can get me every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM or streamed online at www.saga960am.ca, or all my podcasts and videocasts after the fact at briancrombie.com. Thank you for joining us. Good night.